let's get started. I see a lot of people have joined us. So good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, and thank you for joining us today. It's wonderful to see a lot of people in the room. My name is Maya Persson, and I'm the Senior Advisor for Communications and Knowledge Management for IDEAL. Once again, welcome to this culmination event of IDEAL's knowledge sharing series on humanitarian development, peace, coherence. Before we start, we'd like to inform you that this session will be recorded and that we're providing interpretation in French. So please go ahead and select your preferred language. You can do so by clicking interpretation. There is an icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen. It looks like a globe. Click that and select either English or French. You can choose to mute the original audio or listen to it at a lower volume. It's important that everyone selects a language, so please click either English or French. In January, USAID released the Programming Considerations for Humanitarian Development, Peace, Coherence. Following that, IDEAL launched the Knowledge Sharing Series in June. We wanted to convene humanitarian and resilience practitioners for peer-to-peer sessions to explore current practices and enabling factors for HDP coherence in different contexts. Since June, 500 individual participants have attended our series of 13 sessions exploring 4 thematic areas, which you can see in this graphic. In the next 2 hours, this is how we'll spend our time together. After some context setting from us at IDEAL, we'll hear welcome remarks from USAID's Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance. Then we'll look back on the knowledge sharing series sessions through a panel discussion among guest speakers, each representing a thematic area. Our guest speakers will draw out key takeaways from the sessions and discuss cross-cutting themes across the 4 areas. Our goal is to give everyone a good sense of the discussions and key learnings from the sessions to be prepared for the second half of this session. In the second half, we'll look forward to our journey on HDP coherence. You'll be invited to small groups and reflect on what you heard from the guest speakers and consider how you might apply learning to your work and how we can move forward. Our goal is to foster losing the script there. Our goal is to foster peer-to-peer sharing and learning in these small groups. And then finally, we'll come back together for a plenary session where we'll share out from the breakout groups and discuss ways that we can move forward as a community towards more HDP coherent programming. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to my co-host today, Susanna Mari, IDEAL's Acting Activity Director. Over to you, Susanna.
Thank you, Maya, and welcome everyone. For those of you who are less familiar with IDEAL, or who are just hearing about IDEAL through this knowledge sharing series, I'd like to provide a brief introduction. The IDEAL activity is funded by USAID's Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance and works to support the United States government's goal of improving food and nutrition security among the world's most vulnerable households and communities. IDEAL addresses knowledge and capacity gaps expressed by the food and nutrition security implementing community, supporting them in the design and implementation of effective emergency and non-emergency food security activities. This knowledge sharing series is part of IDEAL's work to provide opportunities for implementers to share and learn from each other's challenges and successes around issues that are pertinent to those who are working in the food security space. You can learn more about how IDEAL supports the work of the food security implementing community by visiting the FSN Network website and signing up for our bi-weekly newsletter. The link was just shared in the chat. I'm delighted to have Kevin Brown joining us today to provide some welcoming remarks. Mr. Brown has a wealth of experience from both the humanitarian and development pillars of assistance, and was most recently the Supervisory Program Officer in Ghana. And prior to that, he served as the Senior Project Development Officer and Acting Director of USAID's Pakistan Office of Program Management. He served as the Deputy Director and subsequently the Director of USAID West Bank and Gaza's Strategic Planning and Analysis Office. And he was the senior USAID representative to the US Consulate General in Jerusalem and served 3 consecutive tours at the USAID mission to Nigeria. Mr. Brown currently serves as the Deputy Director of the Office of Technical and Program Quality and in USAID's Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance. As many of you know, BHA is the lead US federal coordinator for international disaster assistance and monitors, mitigates, and responds to global hazards and humanitarian needs before, during, and after a crisis. And with that, Kevin, thank you for being here, and over to you.
Thank you for that introduction, Suzanne. I truly do appreciate it. And I also want to say good morning, everyone. I'm honored to welcome you to the knowledge sharing event this morning and excited to see so many of you joining today's event. As Suzanne noted, I've had a very fulfilling career with USAID so far, and it's true that these experiences have really allowed me to witness how vital it is to strengthen those connections between our short-term emergency relief efforts and the longer-term development, resilience, and peace activities. You know, when we think about USAID's work, we must consider its totality and the cyclical nature of the humanitarian development peace relationship. You have multiple and compounded shocks driven by climate, COVID, and conflict, and their increasing global food insecurity, making food production more challenging, raising prices, exhausting people's resilience, and eroding hard-won development gains. Now, how do we as a global community address this? While at the UN General Assembly, President Biden announced a $2.9 billion contribution to support global food security efforts. $2 billion of that will support humanitarian assistance in food insecure areas. Though this commitment is major, there still isn't a scenario where available funds will be enough to cover the scale of humanitarian disasters. It's very important that we pause and reflect on where we are and where we want to be. It's also important that we begin to think critically to identify and implement innovative, locally based solutions that are undergirded in the HDP principles in order to propel communities towards self-reliance. Further, to advance the HDP coherent approaches, we must encourage behavior change among all members in a society, from citizens to local governments to parliaments and presidential administrations. You know, this requires full participation, engagement, and ownership from all individuals. Behavior change is inherently a participatory process, which requires addressing the core constraints and provides a meaningful outcome directly linked to impact. With our partners, USAID is making progress. For example, in Ethiopia, the Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance and the US government's Feed the Future activities are layered with the Protective Safety Net program, which provides multi-sectoral and emergency support to better meet people's holistic needs. USAID Ethiopia also created a strategic advisory group for emergencies. This is an internal USAID platform of technical experts who, by supporting the HDP cycle, provide multi-hazard monitoring and facilitate expedited modifications to develop activities in crisis areas. Also in Niger, USAID supports the World Food Program to layer food for assets with BHA's activities to mitigate acute hunger and rising food prices. And another example, in Mali, USAID implements an innovative sequencing process that transitions WFP's rapid response to NGO early recovery activities. There are so many examples of USAID's progress and work, and you can read more about those in USAID's paper, Programming Considerations for Humanitarian Development Peace Coherence. These examples will highlight the goal of this approach, which is to achieve better, more sustainable outcomes for the people we serve and reduce the level of humanitarian need. USAID is also incorporating and mainstreaming HDP coherence in its policies and strategies across the agency. In addition to adhering to the OECD Development Assistance Committee's Nexus recommendation, HDP Coherence can be found, is a key focus and can be found in the following strategies. We have the USAID's climate strategy, the global food security strategy, the US global water strategy, the US strategy to prevent conflict and promote stability, the BHA strategic framework for early recovery, risk reduction, and resilience, and the upcoming 2022 resilience strategy. Combined with these efforts, like Ideal's knowledge sharing series, I'm excited to see the positive shift in momentum to strengthen the HDP coherence. I'm confident that today's sessions will be productive and inspiring, and I look forward to hearing more about the discussions and outcomes. I just want to say thank you again for helping to build our collective knowledge and laying the path to advance HDP coherence. And I'll turn it back to you, Suzanne. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kevin, for those opening remarks and for sharing BHA's, the work that BHA is doing in humanitarian development and peace coherence, the great examples from the programming considerations document, which was really the basis of this series. So I'm excited now to go back, to look back and to invite our panelists to speak more about what we covered throughout the series. And with that, we have a great panel who will help us look back. During the panel, participants are welcome to add comments and questions in the chat box. And if we don't have time to address your questions, there will be space during the breakout group discussions to address those. So now I'm happy to introduce our panelists who will share learnings from the 4 thematic areas covered during the series. First, Norma Toussaint is the Food Security and Learning Senior Advisor for Mercy Corps' IDEAL team. Welcome, Norma. Greg Macabila is the Deputy Chief of Party for MEAL for its Catholic Relief Services IFA Resilience Food Security Activity in Ethiopia. Jim Flock works for ACDI VOCA as the Chief of Party of USAID's Resilience Learning Activity in East Africa. And Saika Kabir is the former Director of Knowledge Management, Research, Learning, and Communications for USAID BHA-funded Resilience Food Security Activity Noba Jatra, which is led by World Vision in Bangladesh. So Norma, we'll start with you. You were the technical lead for the Advancing Locally Led HDP Coherence technical area. What is locally led HDP Coherence and why is it important?
Thanks, Suzanne, and good morning, everyone. So HDP Coherence aims to capture the interlinkages between the humanitarian, development, and peace sectors, as we learned from Kevin Brown this morning. And it aims to overcome these sector silos. Locally led HDP Coherence not only recognizes and centers local actors, but it is also an intentional shift of power and decision-making to local communities. And locally led is important because in order to ensure sustainability of our resilient programming, it is not enough to speak about local solutions. It requires a realignment with the realities of the local communities, who are the largest stakeholders in our programming. Furthermore, it is also about allowing space and flexibility for local actors to share their own definition of what locally led HDP Coherence means for them and looks like in their context. Over to you, Suzanne.
Thanks, Norma. And we had really great examples of all of that throughout the series that I know you're going to share with us even more. Greg, you were panelist in one of the sessions under the Data for Decision Making thematic area. What are some key elements you heard in the discussions on M&E in those sessions that can promote or facilitate HDP coherence?
Thank you so much, Suzanne. A lot was discussed during the sessions, and one of the big things is having common understanding with the stakeholders on the data needs, especially among the anticipated users across the HDP sectors. For example, you need to have consultations even before you think about collecting any data. Make sure you've talked with the government, stakeholders, other actors, for example, other USAID activities and other non-governmental organizations working in the area, so that they are anticipating those results or that data for use, and that makes it much easier for them to use. The other thing is really building opportunities and relationships for information sharing and discussions on the data uses, identifying ways where you can start discussing with people once the results are in. You share with them and you start using them. A good example is like in Ethiopia, we have stakeholders like one program called the Joint Emergency Operations, who we have discussions on how we can use each other's data. For example, they collect data on markets and we collect data at household level. So we try to use their market data to improve the well-being of our households. But that takes a platform of data sharing. They have an online platform where every stakeholder has access to it. And we have meetings which we attend and we convene to bring other stakeholders together. So those are some of the key points I would mention to this. Thank you.
Thanks, Greg. Jim, you joined us to talk about backbone mechanisms under our communication and coordination thematic area. What did you learn in the sessions about how an approved approach to communication and coordination can facilitate or strengthen HDP coherence?
I learned quite a bit. Thanks, Suzanne. And I think, first of all, it requires time and financial resources. In some cases, to partners or to others, you have to identify proof of concept that shows it's worth the investment to work with the backbone programs. And this is notable if other mechanisms and partners do not have contractual mandates that apply to the HDP coherence. I think one thing we saw in the coordination and communication session was the strategic advisory group of experts, or the SAGE working group out of Ethiopia. And within the USAID Ethiopia mission, SAGE is a recognized and trusted and group that frequently reports to the mission leadership on what actions need to be taken based on shifting context. And because of the direct line of leadership, the mission is able to compress the timelines and the decision-making, allowing for adaptive management or rapid response in terms of humanitarian assistance. It gives them that ability to quickly analyze the events, the data, and the shifting resources, and to make sure that they're addressing the crises that come up. And I think one of the good examples you can see in some of the background is their work on the COVID-19. One of the other things was sequencing, layering, and integration, and leveraging existing platforms. So building off kind of both of what Norma and Greg said is there's a lot of good information, there's a lot of local information. And so from the beginning, you look at what is available and do an exercise to identify areas where you can find the information that you will need and look for efficiencies within program operations. In Ethiopia, USAID uses support contracts, especially around security and other existing mechanisms to inform decision-making. With the Global Food Security Cluster and the INGO Forum, joint mapping of HDP actors identify who's doing what and where. The Somalia Resiliency Partnership also has mapping that's available on an open source. So in terms of that onboarding and offboarding of new partners entering into programs, it provides real-time data of activities and whatnot. And I think just two other quick points is the country team management sessions. They talked about communication and coordination and learning across all kinds of assistance. And while we talk about these macro, I think it's also notable to keep it small and simple, like joint meetings, notably for the country management between those emergency and the emergency response and the development assistant teams that can kind of help you achieve coherence. I think sometimes the smaller tasks help people familiarize themselves, understand how they can be included in different access of humanitarian assistance, to kind of also create that bridge between development and emergency aid concerns. And I think to that, one of the final point is just the planning jointly and seeking a common agenda, but also to be flexible in that in terms of the HDP. The joint work planning, the work in terms of building local systems and working with government officials, multi-donors. The example in the Partnership for Resilience of Economic Growth in Kenya It ensures that this co-creation process is going on with local county officials, their annual work plans, along with donor annual work plans, and that you're feeding into the national efforts with the funding from the programs so that you're aligned with these initiatives. Things will change in northeastern Kenya, along with the Horn of Africa. There's obviously been a lot of drought affecting the area. So it's also that point of being flexible and understanding what is serving the needs of the people. So with that, Suzanne, I'll stop there and kick it back over to you.
Thanks, Jim. And yeah, thanks. The coordination, talking about the intentionality and needing to, really come to that common agenda. It came up several times. Coordination in and of itself does not facilitate HDP coherence. The cluster systems are meant for coordination, but they can also create silos. So I think it's really great that we're talking about it as it's not just about coordination. It's all the things that you put towards the efforts that you put towards that coordination. Saika, you spoke with us in August about how development programs can prepare for shocks during our sessions on sequencing, layering, and integrating humanitarian development and peace assistance. In what ways does sequencing, layering, and integrating advance HDP coherence?
Thanks, Suzanne. I think what's come across really clearly from hearing the other panelists is how much common ground that we all have and the issues and themes that resonate across all the different contexts. So the discussions during our sessions, they really showed that having a long-term presence on ground allowed organizations to support people-centered approaches and develop community trust that allowed the programs to better sequence, layer, and integrate activities to achieve HDP coherence. So having sufficient time, that was critical, to establish a base for coordination of HDP activities at the local level. Assessment, monitoring, and evaluation across activities was also crucial, and is something mentioned by Greg earlier. All activities across the sessions noted that their presence on the ground allowed them to assess the effects of a crisis or any threats quite quickly and monitor conditions. In Bangladesh, the RIFSA were able to conduct rapid assessments to inform pivots. In South Sudan, they were able to develop custom indicators for flexibility and adaptability based on rapidly evolving contexts. Integration was also another binding theme that emerged, integration of activities and approaches. For example, South Sudan, West Africa, and Bangladesh integrate nutrition, WASH, and gender-based violence activities to build resilience and response capacity in the long term. Several activities also noted the value of village savings and lending associations as mechanisms for integration and community cohesion. Speaking to the point on coordination and collaboration, which you mentioned and also was mentioned by Jim, there were examples of operating early warning systems in partnership with the government. And in Bangladesh, the RIFSA was designed to build on existing government systems. And by way of example, is committees at various levels, your water sanitation committees, child protection committees, and coordinating through area-based programming, as you mentioned, was also identified in a number of contexts, including Ethiopia and Mali. The flexibility part was also critical because it's an important precondition for effective sequencing, layering, and integration, whether it's in the form of a crisis modifier, flexible budgets, or contingency funding. An activity can't adaptively manage shocks and risks about what works and what doesn't without flexible funding. So that was another key area. So with that, back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Saika. And yes, so many things that touch across the different thematic areas. And I think it was one of the things that was really exciting about the series is that even if you weren't able to participate in a particular thematic area, it still locally led was touched on in later themes. Although sequencing, layering, and integrating was on the calendar the last last theme that we specifically spoke to, it came up throughout the earlier areas. So really, we're gonna is really a lot of exciting work that across. So I want to now turn a little bit to challenges. And so what are some of the challenges to HDP coherence? You raised some of them, as you were speaking about your particular thematic area, but what were challenges raised during the sessions? And can you share any specific practical examples of partners overcoming those challenges that were shared during the sessions? Greg, I'm gonna start with you this time.
Thank you, Suzanne. And that's a very good question. Like, one of the biggest challenges, like all actors in Ethiopia and maybe beyond have experienced, is this issue of changing context. For the first time in many years of implementation, the past 5 years were brutal in terms of contextual difficulties. All the theoretical assumptions, the contextual assumptions we put in our theory of change came to pass. COVID came as a pandemic. Locusts came as another big problem, and the economy also went to another direction. So these really challenged actors across both the development and the humanitarian sectors, and we found ourselves flipping on both sides, which really triggered the need for people to start working together in terms of changing their approach for intervention. The other challenge that we commonly face is the quality of data, and part of it being the availability of that data. So you find, like, because of these challenges that we have been experiencing, like security, like COVID-19, data collection was difficult in most of the areas, and very few stakeholders or actors were able to generate data that would be used. And at the same time, the capacity to collect that data in the new ways that are being collected was a big challenge, and that continues to be a challenge as we talk about now. And the last challenge I would like to mention is the whole idea of data sharing. There's still a situation whereby not all actors in the sector are willing and able to share the data to different stakeholders in the same way, in a timely manner, among other factors. So in some context, to resolve this challenge of data sharing, we have seen conveners, like it could be a donor-motivated convener or a government-motivated convener, who bring the stakeholders together and really trying to get the data in a place where the people can try to share it. And in the context of changing operational context or contextual environment, I think we've seen a lot of adaptations among the different stakeholders. We had solutions such as having community embedded enumerators to try and really be available on the ground and to get that data captured when the context change. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Greg. And it's great that you started us with the challenge on context, because that's really why we're speaking about HDP coherence. It's really why this is such an important topic, and it is, we don't live in, static development context, static humanitarian context. Things are changing all of the time, and we need to be prepared for shocks, whether it's in our long-term resilience food security programming, or even in our shorter-term humanitarian programming or protracted crisis. All of these, contexts can change at any point, and being prepared for that is really, one of the key purposes of HDP coherence. And I think that, the recommendations for data sharing that were given during those sessions, having the humanitarian teams provide their evaluations to development resilience teams, so they can they can use that data, they can build on that, not just keeping things so project focused. Really love that. Jim, what are some challenges to communication and coordination that came up through the sessions?
I think one of the common themes, and both can be applied to development and humanitarian assistance and building off the CLA principles, is the M&E for learning, which feeds into strengthening local systems and actors. And so as you go through these processes of what Greg and Norma was talking about, the idea to do this kind of co-creation and co-implementation, the co-monitoring, you want to make sure that these systems are being reported up to the structures for the respective entities that are doing this. While it's good to show that, it also just allows for that tracking so that as you do these, each entity kind of shows where they're strengthening within the local system, but also to the reporting entity, be that USAID or another donor. And so seeking to align that, it's one of the things that the USAID Kenya mission is doing and training their Kenyan counterparts in the M&Es, so that more of the data is reported through the Kenyan National Monitoring and Evaluation System, but also that the partners are also reporting that in through the DIS or through their own performance monitoring plans. The country team also discussed too, in their sessions, was ways to integrate emergency and development tools into one tool, which include a shared M&E platform. And that's with the recognition that the tools can function differently in different contexts, but again, you're trying to capture that data so it can be used moving forward and understanding that. In the session for communication, coordination, and learning across assistance, it's the sharing and synchronizing data for joint situation analysis. In terms of who is doing what and where. Also, there are challenges around data sharing and mechanisms, which Greg had eloquently pointed out, and that we need to secure and harmonize the data and sharing the mechanisms to that as well too. And I think to that point, it also is thinking very creatively and very easily, because I think Google Docs does this well, but it's the use of knowledge management projects. And so it's that challenge around making access to data and also how to use communication and coordination platforms sustainable. KM repositories for access to data should be allowed to users who want to use and have this information available, allow them to explore sites, to analyze what has been done in the past. So you can learn from that. You can either build off it or you can generate new ideas. And so I think to that is part of the backbone, the communication activities. It's that as we develop these new initiatives, we also understand how to share this across a wide array of audiences, be that local government, be it the communities we're serving, be it other donors, other USAID partners. I think that is something that we also had noted. And a lot of those, you can look at community media, you could look at local radio, event forums, Facebook, WhatsApp, and other communication messages, and how really those messages based on the data collected, how do you share that to an NGO community, to a donor community, to a host country, to these regional actors, to private sector, and to the communities at large. And sometimes I think that was something that, with all that's going on, to make sure to stay on point with that in the service of the community. And I think to some of those, there's always competing interest that kind of came out. Often you can lose appropriate people that should be in these forums, in these activities. Sometimes that's operational for those that are within county government or to other initiatives. It might be based just on where they're directed by their senior staff. It could be based on kind of competing per diem rates. If there's no contractual or cooperative mandates, sometimes programs won't be willing to join on for that. So I think trying to provide some of those within the backbone structures as guidelines, being respective of entities have their own policies and procedures, but also it includes not just that, but types of M&E indicators, types of knowledge management tools, so that from the onboarding or the offboarding process, there is kind of an inclusiveness as more people come in to provide work, or they're coming in for rapid response. You don't kind of need to reinvent that. And I think what we saw from the DRC had a conversation in terms of one of the sessions on how their country frequently uses WhatsApp, but local media in Kenya also had played a role in terms of training the community to kind of share how they wouldn't report it, the HDP principles, working with system strengthening, but just showing how the work the county government is doing. And that's kind of the way messages can be transferred. And I think from the country team's perspective, one of the challenges they showed was, again, that integration of humanitarian and development programming. So that was a key theme. in noting that within these country programs, some contracts and agreements have crisis modifiers, others do not. So there is a challenge in terms of budgeting to target things more specifically moving forward. And with that, I think it feeds again into that, trying to bridge that gap between development and humanitarian program teams. And sometimes the country teams had noted staff are afraid to change, or they can be protective of their roles, different requirements for different projects. And so just making sure that ongoing communication also internally is being carried forward as well. So
thanks, Jim. I think, yeah, the, motivation and for coordination and the factors that facilitate that, don't always go, along with the programs. So just, that's a good point for us to make sure that those things are in place, and so we get rid of, can mitigate some of those fears that staff have about doing being more cooperative and coordinating with staff that may work on other projects. Saika, can you share with us some challenges that were raised about sequencing and layering humanitarian development and peace assistance?
So building on Jim's point around staffing and those challenges of different teams working together, limited human resources within implementing partners to work across humanitarian and development activities was cited as a challenge, and linked to this was staff retention issues. And one way to overcome this was via organizational capacity building, being very intentional about that, and also having a staff retention plan in place. And this was a great example from Mali in terms of having staff retention strategies in place and seeing an impact in retaining qualified staff. And linked to this, I'd like to add that another challenge was when you're working with different donors with different styles of working and different reporting requirements, different sort of project cycles, that can also be a challenge. And Mercy Corps had a great example of having activity startup teams who were really experienced at working across the nexus and were experienced in working with different donors as well. Another example of a challenge was the notion that having so many interventions can overwhelm participants and communities. In one session, it was noted that local communities are often unaware of the various activities being implemented by different implementing partners. And two strategies for mitigation included creating community accountability committees and maximizing the use of time-saving technologies. So thanks. With that, over to you.
Thanks, Saika. Yeah, it's always a worry that as maybe the organizations that are implementing programs try to become coherent, they start to pass on chaos to the participants in the household. So making sure that the coherence makes it down to the actual activity and implementation level, which I think speaks great to you. Some of the challenges that were raised during the Advancing Locally Led HDP Coherence sessions, Norma. What are some of those challenges to really being more locally led?
Thanks, Suzanne. Yes, absolutely. There are a lot of challenges. So, at the start of our KSS journey, we established that local actors are natural nexus dwellers, and they rarely operate in sectoral silos. So how do we define local, and who defines local determines who's doing the leading? For example, for Coffee for Peace, based in the Philippines, we learned from them that they specifically look at power dynamics. For them, whoever had less power was defined as local. And overcoming this challenge requires level setting and establishing a common understanding at the start, which Greg mentioned earlier. And having the flexibility to challenge and refine the definition as context evolves is also a challenge. Another challenge is that weak and limited infrastructure in conflict environments can create challenges for social cohesion programming. When engaging with local actors, it is important to remember how complex these social networks can be. While they are integral to social cohesion and can inform how the sector works during crisis, they're not easily leverageable. Weak transportation networks. Another challenge is weak transportation networks to reach remote locations can limit coordination. Another challenge is when transitioning to locally led. When Neura International transitioned to Neura Kenya, there was a communication breakdown and loss of trust by the community. Neura Kenya spoke about how they had to put a lot more effort in getting the community to be more involved in decision-making and the decision-making process. Less communication led to loss of trust, which also led to loss of resources, which needed to be mitigated. Greg pointed out earlier that it's important to identify entry points for integrating feedback from the community, and that's one way to overcome this challenge. Last point, Coffee for Peace shared that their vision-based approach meant that they had to learn to say no to donors. If there was a misalignment of vision and mission between a donor or potential donor and Coffee for Peace, then they would not accept the funding. A never-ending challenge for them was to always remember that they're working towards a vision and not towards funds. Over to you, Suzanne.
Thanks, Norma. And I think one of the quotes that I will carry with me maybe for the rest of my life, but for sure that this series came from the first session on advancing locally led HDP coherence. It was Zippy who said, the communities are not empty. They have indigenous knowledge that needs to be used, that they need to determine how it's used. But it's really, working, determining how to do that in a way that's not exploiting, the local teams, of really letting the communities lead. That's really can be the challenge for those of us who are external to that community. So thanks so much for raising those. So we've already, touched on all of this. There's so many things that, we don't, cross over into the different themes. But I want to touch on a couple of different areas that came across. I'm not necessarily gonna call on all of you. I invite you to, go off, off mute and chime in and say, yes, that absolutely is, how it came out in our thematic areas or in this particular session. Now I want to talk about, continuing that theme on community engagement, and how important it is really to, at different levels, to make sure that we're rightly engaging with communities. So I feel free, Jim. You talked about community engagement. You want to start us off?
Sure, happy to. And I think from Seika and Norma's and even Greg's, I think the community engagement, and to me, through the backbone mechanisms and the coordination mechanisms, it's a bit of knowledge management along with how to digest and encapsulate that indigenous knowledge that you were referring to. And some of that's through local systems and actors. It doesn't always have to be local government. And so how to use local media, how to do SBC work so that messaging are carrying forward through either indigenous languages, and how us as IPs, to Greg points, is how do you capture even that low level data to continue building on what's working, or capturing the community voice in terms of what they want to learn more about that maybe we're missing because we're not there on a day in and day out basis. And I think from that, in community engagement, that again goes to a widely dispersed amount of consistent KM products. So for those coming in, for those existing there, and for those leaving, you make sure that everything good, bad, and you don't know is widely available to everyone that's committed to trying to support these situations, which are humanitarian, which require humanitarian assistance. And so so that there is something there in terms of trying to help the next person or to continue bridging that gap moving forward. So I think I'll stop there with those points and let others chime in as needed.
I think on the data side of things, we need to respect that communities have other things to do with their time and really engage them in a way that it's not just collecting information, but really getting them to understand why are we getting that info from them, how are they going to use it, and how are we going to use it. So one example of what we've seen is starting that process by meeting with them and really discussing with them the value of the data. We collect high frequency data, sometimes in a long term, and all of these actors, all these HDP actors are on the ground doing the same thing. So you find these communities get fatigued and they don't want to just feel like they're responding for nothing. So really, once that data is collected, analyzed, getting back to them and supporting them to use it. And what we have seen, communities use this data for planning, for advocacy, and even just for their own engagement, as long as you support them to do that. So that's what I can say on the data side of things. Thank you.
One thing I'll add, just building off of Greg's point, just, taking a step back from sort of the technical side of it and really celebrating sort of the divergent views of the communities that we're servicing, that we're operating in. So, community engagement is about celebrating those histories, those identities, the cultures of the communities that we're working in. So really sort of navigating that space and having that, respecting and knowing what they value, so that that data that they are using, it resonates more with them because you have taken that step back to sort of celebrate them.
Yeah, I think it too helps with what you were talking about, Greg, of making sure, getting that data back to the communities. If you're really, celebrating the communities, thinking about how, their perspectives and things, and not thinking of it as your organization's data or your project's data, that we shouldn't, it's not about, that ownership level, that really that data belongs to the people that were willing to offer it to us. And so not just thinking about the fatigue that can be had with all the surveys and, continuous calling, but also, how can we support and give back that data? That's great. Thank you. Saika, anything for you to add?
I think it's all been really well captured by the other panelists, but speaking to that validation of the data, I think it's critical. It's the missing piece of the puzzle, making sure that the communities themselves are able to validate that. They're able to participate in conversations in terms of how we use that data to design activities or programs. It's absolutely critical. And the data is, it should be representative of the community, and making sure that you've got, the women, the children, the adolescents, the elderly, and all those different nuances reflected in the data that you collect, and then have validated before you leverage that data to kind of design any approach or, do a pivot or, whatever that you intend to do. Thanks.
Thanks, Saika. We have a little less than 10 minutes left, but I want to touch on another theme that came across, and that was flexibility. So, obviously there's flexibility that can be needed in so many different aspects of achieving HDP coherence. So I wonder, maybe Saika, you spoke about flexibility and funding, and that was, even specific themes that were, we touched on that flexibility for different donors and longer term funding, but you can speak maybe a little bit more about, what kinds of flexibility can support HDP coherence.
Sure. So there are a number of examples that came up during this session. So there were, and it also kind of linked to the program cycle. So when, how far along in the award you were, the newer awards had that flexibility built into it in the form of cash transfers or social safety net programming. There were other programs that had crisis modifiers, which you could immediately dip into. And then in the case of Bangladesh, which is one of the longest running RIFSAs, towards the tail end now, that they didn't have these mechanisms built in. So it was really a question of repurposing existing funds, identifying the cost savings, but really doing it in a way where you're not taking away from your implementation and your resilience activities. And this also links really closely to the whole discussion around data and analysis, because if you have the data and you have that justification, and then Jim also spoke to this, because you really need to have a really strong case to be able to repurpose funding or pivot. So there were various different mechanisms, but I think one of the challenges identified with crisis modifiers or even having to repurpose existing budgets was that can be a lengthy process. And if you've got a crisis, if in for example, the Bangladesh context, if there's been a cyclone and everything is damaged and gone and people are displaced, time is really critical. So having that flexibility and the pace, not just on the side of the implementing partner, but the donor or the government, to be able to deploy as quickly as possible and divert the energies, the budgets where it's needed. So I think the learning was the newer activities being awarded by DHA have that flexibility inbuilt, but how can we be more responsive to the context that we work in?
Yeah, thanks, Saika. I think of it a little bit as formalized flexibility and informal flexibility, the crisis modifiers, the built-in, rapid response mechanisms that are, into your agreements, or that's, we have some formalized flexibility there. But if the informal flexibility of triggering those modifiers, of having that flexibility in the within your communications with the donor to actually make that pivot quickly, then what's the use of that formal flexibility without the informal? Who else would like to speak about flexibility?
I think I can touch on a few points on flexibility. So like we said, you operate in different contexts, and those contexts keep changing. And what we've learned about flexibility, both from the sessions and what we are seeing now, is it has to be intentional. Your systems have to be geared towards flexibility. Your data management system should be able to change as needed. A good example is when COVID hit, we found that in some countries, Ethiopia, Madagascar, etc., traveling was restricted and consultants were not allowed into the country. Or even if they were allowed with a lot of resource and time wastage because of they having to wait for 2 weeks and that. And we saw a very innovative way of getting the data, whereby people are adopted to small pilots, which are using existing staff rather than having an external person coming in. We've been forced by context to, like I said earlier, to adopt community embedded enumerators, because there are some aspects, some areas, some communities we can't access when insecurity hits, but those people are based there. So I think having systems that are geared towards flexibility and are open to flexibility in terms of collection, data sharing, and data use is very important. Thank you.
I was just going to add, I think we've seen some good examples coming out of the PREG and the SRP, and even knowing the work the SAGE group had done during COVID, but certainly a lot of the crisis in Ethiopia, the SAGE group provides that, and that has been able to provide a little bit quicker turnarounds and timelines. I think under not the PREG as the umbrella, but as the membership in the PREG, we've seen those programs look at their budget and potentially increase cash transfer, where we've seen cost of living increase very quickly since the Russia-Ukraine war. We've seen instead of shifting to the development, which came out during some of the country strategy things, was instead of trying to teach farmers, instead of trying to teach fodder feed or things like that, they just shifted to trying to get there as soon as possible. And that kind of communication, be it within USAID, between the county government, it does require a lot of that listening as well as to being flexible. So also you're not running because of one thing, but you really want to make sure how to use what you have as an NGO or as an IP or as a county government. What is something you have and what's going to provide the maximum amount of gains, certainly during, or I guess limit the maximum amount of degradation during periods of drought or conflict. And so I do think that's one of the areas we've seen, not as the preg mechanism, but in terms of providing that communication as, hey, this is what they're doing, this is what they're doing, here's the overall report, but also kind of falls to those individual entities. And obviously it builds on the country context, it builds on the community context. So you're kind of taking as much of that information as possible and using it to the best of the abilities, because everyone at this point always has to look at the budget, but also just making sure you're efficient with that.
Thanks, Jim. Norma?
Thank you, Suzanne. I think there's just one small point that I'll add for flexibility. I think one thing that resonated or sort of sparked some interest in the last session for locally led was a point made by Coffee for Peace. Talia shared that there's freedom and less stress when being locally led. Talia specifically shared that, there's flexibility of not being bound by log frames, which may make our KMI or our knowledge management and MNE folks cringe a little bit, but she wasn't bound by log frames. Their organization wasn't bound by log frames, and they had the flexibility to negotiate that point with donors. And their time constraints were a little bit different, and so they had a longer runway to deal with issues with the community. Pauline from Neuro Kenya also shared that even in the midst of crisis and emergencies, being in dialogue with the community is vitally important. So just remembering that there is space to pause and reflect and continually identify those entry points to be in dialogue with the community. So it's just having that flexibility.
Great, thanks so much, Norma. And thank you everyone for helping us recap 3 months worth of series in less than an hour. But we're going to pivot soon to break out and get into deeper discussions about those challenges and those successes, and how we can take all of these learnings forward and apply them in the work that we do in our organizations and even the broader humanitarian development and peace assistance systems. I'm really looking forward to that. So I would like to invite each of you now to give one, big takeaway for our participants that are listening in and going into their breakout sessions to think about in your particular area. So I'll start again with you, Norma, for advancing locally led HDP coherence. What's your big takeaway for people to take into this next session?
Thanks, Suzanne. So one big takeaway is contextualize as much as possible. Locally led, as the name implies, means localization and community engagement will look very different across countries and within communities, and that the collaboration and engagement process can't be rushed. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Norma. Greg.
Thank you. I think I'll pick it up from where Norma stopped. Appreciating that the context in which we operate keeps changing, and it's changing more often than it used to change in the past. And really structuring our processes around that as we do HDP coherence is very important.
Thanks, Greg. Jim.
I think from the communication discussions, I think the ideas of the SLI and building on Greg and Norma, the localization of it, that planning jointly, and what we just talked about in terms of the flexibility is you want to have all the parties involved in terms of, making these decisions, and gratefully, be it on this panel, but also be it from the Indigenous communities to county governments to other private sectors, there's a lot of very good committed people that are willing to make this work. So I think the biggest part is making sure that as you collect this, how you transition that, where you hold it, and to be respectful of the audience is one of the big takeaways.
Thank you, Jim. Saika, finally to you.
I agree with everything that everybody has said. So in two takeaways would be integration and the rollout of activities in a way that kind of builds on the nexus of humanitarian and development. So making sure that the development sector, development activities are thinking of the long term, and humanitarian activities are able to leverage and build on that to build community resilience. So integration and the really thoughtful rollout of activities in the longer term.
Thank you so much, Saika. And I think those are great points to take us into those further discussions. We don't have time to take any questions right now, but we do have plenty of time in those breakout groups to dig deeper, and I look forward to that. So thank you all again, and I'll hand it to Maya.
Thank you so much, Suzanne, and thank you to the panelists. That was a super interesting and engaging discussion, so thank you all so much for that. Because then we'll also come back as a big group and kind of look forward. So I hope you're going to stay with us for this next half hour. For the small group discussions. We're going to divide ourselves into these topics. Group 1 will talk about locally led HDP Coherence. Group 2, data for decision making for HDP Coherence. Group 3, organizing and collaborating for HDP Coherence. Group 4 and 5 will both talk about sequencing, layering, and integration. We actually have already divided you all into these groups because most of you selected during registration. So you will just be swept into a breakout group, and once in there, there will be a facilitator and a note taker and taking care of you and leading the discussion. So it will be easy, just follow along. A special message to our Francophone participants, just to note that breakout room 5 will have bilingual facilitators and note takers. We can't offer interpretation in the breakout group, but we'll be using a shared document that has French translations in addition to the English text. And I did want to add as well that a few of you may not be already pre-assigned to a breakout room. If that's you, if you notice that you're still in the main room, you can actually click the icon on your Zoom screen that says breakout room to select and join the room of your choice. And if you have any troubles whatsoever, my wonderful colleague Suzanne Barakas will be in the main room and help you to get to whatever room you want to go. So with that, we'll see you back here in 30 minutes or a little less because we're a little bit behind. So see you then. Thank you. Welcome back, everyone. I see everybody is being swept back to the main room. I hope you had time to finish up your discussions. I know sometimes the timer just ends as you were in the middle of a conversation, but I hope you had time to finish up. Thank you for joining those. Welcome back. I hope those discussions were fruitful. As a reminder, click the interpretation button again as you come back and choose English or French. So please go into the interpretation, choose English or French as your preferred language. In the interest of time, we'll jump straight to the report out from each room, and I will ask the reporters to please tell the rest of us about the key points of the discussion in 2 minutes each. I know this is not a lot of time, but we do need to move forward fast here. So please stick to 2 minutes max, and let's start with room 1. Not sure if Pat or Nell will be our reporter from that room.
Hey, this is Pat reporting out from Group 1. One of the key things, or a couple of the key things that we discussed was the need for discussion and dialogue. And this came out from the sessions earlier in June as well, where as practitioners and implementers, we need to be in constant dialogue with communities to make sure that we're understanding their history, their indigenous or community knowledge, and understanding how those communities themselves change and evolve. So dialogue beyond that is also important to like building trust and integrating communities into responses from the start. And so again, not maintaining these rigid structures, making sure that there's flexibility to really define our terms and to evaluate who's holding the power and what those stakeholders are. Something that kind of one of our participants mentioned was that unfortunately, Western actors, whether it's donors or INGOs, we've kind of asked local actors to narrow their goals to fit specific funding opportunities when we're, by comparison, when we're speaking about HDP Coherence or the triple nexus, whatever it may be, we're trying to go backwards now. We're trying to say, hey, you know, we want to do it all, versus our partners from the ground, they've been trying to do it all from the beginning. And so it really requires us to listen to them and say, hey, you know what, you take the lead, you take the charge, because you've been talking about this nexus or the HDP coherence thing for forever. And so we're kind of coming back to you now. And then we also spoke about context and how context is constantly changing. And again, we need to be flexible. Logistically, we need to be able to mesh our systems with local partners and government. Even something as simple as per diem can raise a large problem. And so making sure that we've built enough trust and we're comfortable enough to have really taboo conversations. I know per diem is sensitive, other things may be sensitive, but we need to be able to have that trust to have those taboo conversations. And then finally, INGOs and Western actors need to be willing to give up power. This is hard and kind of close to impossible as we move against the grain in a lot of ways, but it's one of those things that's essential. And so in giving up that power, we're allowing communities and local structures to, one, define their own terms, whether the term is peace, inclusion, or participation, but also kind of supporting and embracing those terms there. And so in the interest of time, I'm gonna stop there. It was a very rich discussion. And so thank you everybody in Group 1 for kind of your comments, and I apologize if I missed anything. Over.
Thank you so much, Pat. Over to Stacy for room 2.
Sorry, I was still just organizing my notes, so I apologize to my group in advance if I don't do a good job of reflecting our sessions. So it was a really small group, but we had a really, I think, rich discussion. We started out talking about context monitoring and wanting to make sure that it's locally led, but also that it's providing the information that we need to trigger maybe shifts between the H or the D or the P. One thing that was brought up was the RMS data source, and does that need to be, do we need to be using that more in terms of context monitoring tool that can be used at a variety of levels? In thinking about context monitoring, one thing that came out was there really being a gap in monitoring levels of social cohesion, recognizing that gap is not just in context monitoring, but it's a gap across the board for a lot of agencies, including USG, in terms of having adequate measures of social cohesion in evaluations, but then also in context, recognizing when that potentially is changing in a given context. We also talked about improvements in data sharing across the different levels of implementers, across the donor, all the way up to the donor and beyond, with the various stakeholders that are in each individual context. There was some discussion around data itself, the data that is being collected. I mean, that's always a huge concern. I mean, Greg brought it up in the overarching session, just the amount of data being collected. It does need to be lighter, but at the same time, is it fitting it into a framework that enables the sharing, having a better, potentially overarching framework into which that data fits might enable better sharing across all the different stakeholders. Another conversation that we had was around simplifying the tools that are available as well, that are being used. And then we also talked about the data that's being used. Also, does it, the most effective use that we're kind of seeing is that in actually reflection sessions that are built into awards, where you actually do get all the various stakeholders together and do look at the monitoring data, do look at some of the evaluation data, and really reflect on what you can pull from it and what changes are made. I mean, that seems to be, at least from the CRS context, what we hear the most in terms of when we actually use the data for decision making. It's having those regular reflection sessions. I think that covers everything that we talked about. And I, again, apologies if I missed anything from our group. Thank you.
Thank you, Stacey. Over to room 4, Maxwell. No, room 3. Sorry, I skipped the room. Melissa, I'm so sorry. Room 3, Melissa.
Thank you. I thought I missed something. Hi, everybody. We discussed collaboration and coordination in our working group, and there was a lot of discussion and interest in that Coffee for Peace program, which really focused on creating and crafting and sticking to a joint vision, a community vision, and a greater development vision, and how to do that as partners, and how to nurture local partners and communities to have the international community embrace that vision longer term. I think folks are curious on how to do that, and a big emphasis was on mapping and data sharing, pause and reflect sessions, after actions, sharing and creating tools, facilitation plans, agendas, and guidance that really promote and a sharing culture, and pausing even in times of crisis. There were also discussions about the importance of convening power and donor flexibility, a lot of discussions about donor expectations, and some curiosity over whether there is a false narrative of donor restrictions on flexibility or not. So I think that's something that the partner community might want to hear more about or needs to learn more about. And then also a really interesting discussion on really empowering and passing down power to local partners and communities. And there are good practices and lessons, including being more intentional in the choices of local partnerships, including in the design stage, testing out graduation approaches, more training on grants and compliance, and making sure that local partners are invited to those discussions. Co-creations for small grants, someone called it taking them on a journey, but also the need for INGOs especially to be purposeful and invest in long-term capacity building for partners, even if it's not maybe sexy or in demand by donors and others, but making a purposeful commitment to that vision. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much. And now over to you, Maxwell.
Yeah, thank you. So for group 4, we really had interesting discussions, and some of the key takeaways or response from the team is we need to be deliberate in designing a system that allows flexibility. I'm sure we'll keep hearing about flexibility, because basically that is something that is key for us to be able to achieve the HDP nexus. And then also another thing that has been we agreed and discussed on is institutionally or within organizations, we should be able to design programs with learning and adaptation in mind, because that is also key, because we work in changing contexts regularly. There are some learnings that need to be incorporated into the already designed program. So we need to have that kind of flexibility for us to incorporate the new learning. Another point that we've also mentioned is of course, donors to be able to also be part of this movement. They should be able to take the lead to ensure that, the SLI is actually incorporated in ensuring that we achieve the HDP at the end of the day. Because if donors are not supportive of it, it's going to be very difficult for actors to achieve this desired result. Co-creation also is another important strategy that we mentioned, which has to be done, across different, level, globally, regionally, and of course within the national strategies. And of course, we also mentioned the issue of leveraging across multiple interventions, within the organization. So sometimes, even within organizations, there are different interventions that can actually be leveraged upon, but some of these interventions tends to go in silos. So leveraging on existing multiple interventions will actually help achieving the HDP. Yeah, so basically, these are just some few points. Apologies to the group in case I missed out anything. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Maxwell. Our last room, over to you, Danielle.
Thank you. Yeah, and a lot has been said already that resonated for our group, so I'll wrap it up quickly here. I think our group reflected that there is already a lot happening on SLI, and it was a theme that we heard come across the other 3 thematic areas. So we were encouraged that it seems there's a lot to learn. The importance of having the systematic area-based management strategies and continuing to make sure that there's a portfolio of programming so that we can look at resilience across the larger area was important. We talked about maybe needing some more efforts to really capture some of these positive examples. So the SAGE model in Ethiopia was mentioned. There's some work happening in Niger and their resilience portfolio that under the RISE-2 mechanism that was mentioned, needing to learn from the RMSs, the recurrent monitoring systems that are usually in RIFSAs could be another opportunity to learn, and some efforts in Nigeria around Feed the Future and BHA kind of SLI. So some more efforts to document those, and then the space to actually learn and discuss what types of data and information sources are most needed to really enhance SLI across humanitarian development and peace, and to really think about what are the types of decisions that would support SLI, what are those data sources, and then to start to really work through some of those issues around incentives, award structure, even like, data security, some of those other sticky issues that have come up. Thanks to everyone in our group. It was a great discussion. Thanks, Danielle, and thanks to everyone who reported out and for all of you participating in those breakout groups. It's really we want to continue to look forward, and I think Danielle, you started us off really great on some of the things that we could be doing. So now we're going to ask you one more question. So you can follow the link that was that we're going to be sharing in the chat, or use your phone to scan this QR code that is on the screen. We're asking you, what do you think might be helpful in the next steps of our collective learning journey around HDP coherence? So please take a few seconds to enter your thoughts on this question. You can answer as many times as you would like. You're not restricted to answering just one time, but we will and we'll be able to see those as they come in. So please welcome your thoughts. This can be, you can think big, system structures, or even personally, what would be personally helpful for you in your next steps in our learning journey around HDP coherence. Right. Yeah, so sharing real world examples, that was something that we definitely heard throughout the series is we just need more examples of how this can be done. Yeah, case studies, great. Identifying knowledge and capacity gaps. Right, working groups. Right.
Yeah, a lot of ideas around sharing promising practices, good concrete examples, but of course also sharing resources and sharing data.
Right. Yeah.
USAID to work with other donors to find ways to align reporting requirements. That's interesting too. We talked about in our group also the importance of making these reports more digestible, more user-friendly.
Yeah. The very specific example of co-location of HDP activities in highly vulnerable areas. All right. Give another few seconds for these to come in.
Yeah.
Please.
And as they come in, I think it's good for us to also notice, please keep them coming. We will put together a report with kind of key findings from the entire series, including this culmination event. So we will try to gather all of these ideas and put them on paper and share with you all.
Yeah. Thanks, Maya. All right. Well, we're going to stop the screen share, but you can still enter your thoughts in here, and it's really great to see all these ideas. And yeah, they aren't, like Maya said, they aren't just going to sit on this slide. They are we are going to take them forward and keep moving them. So I want to thank everyone for being a part of this event. It's really a testament to your commitment to learning, wrestling with these challenging topics with your peers, ultimately for the goal of improving food security outcomes. So we titled the series, the knowledge sharing series, A Collective Journey Toward Humanitarian Development and Peace Coherence. But our journey does not end here. We've just finished one part of the journey. Over the next year, IDEAL will continue on this journey, and we hope you'll join us. We will be exploring crisis and context monitoring, models for community engagement, HDP coherent M&E systems, and even more. So I want to say thank you to all the panelists, not just today, but who supported the entire series, and to BHA for being really, not just our donor, but our partner in getting this series off the ground, and all of my IDEAL colleagues, Maya, Camille, Suzanne, Matheson, your team, the technical leads, Norma, Frank, Eric, Nick, and all those who supported you in getting these sessions together. I just really want to thank you all. So before Maya tells us a bit more about how we can access all the materials from this series, I invite you to complete the survey for this event. It'll take less than 3 minutes to fill out, but it really does help us to look forward and making sure that these events and this, and what we do going forward is the most relevant for you and the broader implementing community.
Great, thank you, Suzanne. So as you fill out the survey, I want to share with you a great page on the FSN network where we have compiled all the knowledge sharing series materials on a collection page. So this culmination event will also be added there in the next few days. You can find recordings and other related materials. So you can see the link in the chat for that collection page. It's really handy to just find all the previous sessions. So if you missed a session, I can recommend, viewing the recording or just listening to it to kind of catch up on what has been said. Stay in touch with us at Ideal and hear about our future offerings, as well as important news from the food security community by subscribing to the FSN Network newsletter. And follow us on social media. We have a very active LinkedIn channel now, and you can see the links in the chat. Finally, again, we would love to hear your thoughts on this session so we can improve on our future events. Session survey is linked again in the chat. Should only take you less than 3 minutes to complete. So with that, we'll say goodbye. We'll keep the Zoom meeting open and play some music as you complete the survey. Thank you so much for joining us today, and have a wonderful rest of your day or evening. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.